Sabeeha Rehman is a blogger, a speaker, and author of the memoir Threading My Prayer Rug, One Woman's Journey from Pakistani Muslim to American Muslim. She is an op-ed contributor to the Houses of Worship column of the Wall Street Journal. Her pieces have been published in the New York Daily News, Forward, Salon, Tiferet, and Pathos. Sabeeha migrated from Pakistan to the US in 1971 after her marriage to a Pakistani doctor in New York. She holds a master's in healthcare administration and has had a 25-year career as a hospital executive. Her career spanned hospitals in New York, New Jersey, and Saudi Arabia. Walter Ruby has worked as a journalist for more than 30 years for the Jerusalem Post, Ma'ariv, The Forward, New York Jewish Week, London Jewish Chronicle, Washington Jewish Week, and other publications, and has had postings in Haifa, Israel, New York, and Moscow. He's a co-author of a memoir, Live Another Day, How I Survived the Holocaust and Realized the American Dream. That's with Michael Edelstein. And he's currently, from 2008 to 2017, as Muslim-Jewish Relations Director of the New York-based Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, Ruby brought together Muslims and Jews in synagogues and mosques for dialogue. He presently serves as Executive Director of Jews, Muslims, and Allies Acting Together in Greater Washington, and as coordinator of the Washington area chapter of Project Rosanna, which works to strengthen ties between Israelis and Palestinians through healthcare. So let's welcome our speakers, and I'm going to turn myself off and let them begin.
Well, thank you so much, Sandy. That was really a wonderful introduction, and we're so happy to be here with all of you. So our book is about how, really, if you take the whole thing, and we're going to go through it now, but maybe the central question, how did Sabeeha and I each transition during the course of our lives from basically embracing and celebrating our own particularist identities, Sabeeha as a Pakistani Muslim and myself as an American Jew deeply impacted by my years of living in Israel, to a more universalistic vision of being human beings above all. Our paradigm that we came to over the years is about embracing the American dream at its finest, affirming that all men and women, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, or orientation, are endowed by their Creator with equal rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and with equal right to be treated as full Americans. We believe that this shift of vision fundamentally has impacted our ability to reach across the barricades as proud Jews and proud Muslims and fellow human beings and declare with conviction that we refuse to be enemies. Sabeeha, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you, Walter. Thank you, Sandy, for inviting us, and it's good to be back again. I grew up in Pakistan. I had never met a Jew. Pakistan was and remains pro-Palestinian. So throughout my life in Pakistan, where I lived until I was 20 years old, I viewed the Jews through the lens of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Pakistan had not and still has not recognized Israel. In fact, my father's passport was stamped, all countries of the world except Israel. That is where I came from when I came to the United States. How about you, Walter?
Well, I had never met a Muslim until well into my 20s. I grew up a lonely Jewish child in a predominantly Gentile suburb of Pittsburgh. And my Jewishness kind of came to me through the book Exodus, written by Leon Uris, which was a novel about the creation of the state of Israel that I just kind of fell in love with. And then just a few months later, suddenly I had the opportunity to go and live in Israel as an 11-year-old, because my father was on sabbatical at the Weizmann Institute as a physicist in Israel, in Rehovot, Israel. And I fell deeply in love with Israel and felt connected to my true self as a Jew while I was there. I had at that time no interactions at all with Palestinians, either Christians or Muslims, with one exception. There was a day when my family was driving to the beach, and we stopped. We saw some Bedouin with their tents, and they had some camels, and the elder of the tribe sort of gestured to us to come over, and maybe the kids would have a ride on the camels. We all jumped out of our car, but we were wearing bathing suits. And so the women who were completely covered, especially about my mother, who was wearing a very modest one-piece suit. Anyway, they got upset. We jumped back in the car and kind of zoomed away. And that was the end of that. And so that was my beginnings. But we came back to the US after a year there, and I vowed that I would return to live in Israel sooner or later. Sabeeha?
So the first time I met a Jew was when I came to New York. It was 1971. And my husband, who was a medical resident, took me to the hospital's Christmas party. Half of the medical residents were Pakistani Indian, and the other half were Jewish. And they were all very nice to me, the Jewish residents, that is, welcoming me, asking me how I'm doing. Am I missing home? Am I lonely? How can we help? And I could not reconcile this conflict in my mind of they're supposed to be the bad guys, but they're being so nice to me. And they're really very nice people. And then sure enough, my upstairs neighbor in the apartment who took me under her wing, showed me the ropes, was Jewish. My husband's boss who helped him find his next job was Jewish. When I got pregnant, my obstetrician, Jewish. When I had a baby, the pediatrician, Jewish. And very soon I was finding myself saying, why, all my best friends are Jewish. And then if that wasn't enough, I end up buying a house in an Orthodox Jewish community. I had no idea that it was a Jewish community. I liked the house, I got the house. And on my first weekend there on Saturday, I decided to go introduce myself to my neighbors and went ringing the doorbells and couldn't figure out why, when the cars were out there, nobody was answering the door. My husband's colleague, who was Jewish, his wife said to me, Sabeeha, why did you buy a house in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood? How are you going to fit in? And I had no idea what she was talking about. My father, who was visiting from Pakistan, said to me, people of faith, no matter what their faith, make good neighbors. You living in this community will be good for your children. It will have a good impact on them. They will raise them with values in a disciplined manner. And he was right. Not only that, I got a bonus out of it. I no longer had to explain to my children why we don't have a Christmas tree or why we don't eat pork. How about you, Walter? When was your first encounter?
So I went back to Israel at the age of 26, and I stayed 3 years, which were really the happiest and most fulfilling of my life. I became a journalist while I was there. I was living in the city of Haifa in northern Israel, so I covered many stories in the Arab villages, Arab and Palestinian villages in the Galilee, and got to know them very well. Partly I saw that some of the conflict, some of the discrimination that was being endured by the Israeli Arabs in terms of the amount of resources available to them for their budgets and so forth. But there was something even more important that happened to me there, was that I was so warmly received when I made those visits to those villages. And there was an Arab priest who I got very close to, who was a kind of an advocate of nonviolence. So I was very moved by those encounters, I mean, on a personal level. But then when I would go back to my Israeli Jewish friends, and also some members of my family, my Israeli family, they would say to me, well, you know, when I would tell them about these wonderful encounters, they would say, you don't understand anything. You're a naive American. We know the Arabs. You're kind of having the wool pulled over your eyes. And so at a certain point, I would ask them, well, when were you in that village? Or how many encounters have you had? And invariably, I was having many more encounters, personal encounters with Arabs than any of them they did, but they believed they knew better. What that taught me was probably one of the most important lessons of my life, which was about the transformative power of personal encounters. When you meet people face to face, and they're not symbols of evil or whatever, but they become human beings, you see that falls away, and that's what's so important. And that became the basis of the work that both Sabeeha and I have been doing. Sabeeha, what about you?
Well, for me, that work, interfaith dialogue, it started by the sidewalk. I used to be, I was a homemaker. I had 2 children. So I used to be hanging out with my Jewish friends by the sidewalk, standing on the lawn. And I guess That's where grassroots came from. And we'd be watching the kids and start chatting. I must have invited them over for dinner, and the conversation led to dietary restrictions. Oh, so you don't eat pork either. She must have invited me in for coffee, and I would have said, I'm sorry, but it's Ramadan. Oh, what's that? And that conversation, informal conversation, led to us getting to understand one another's faith and seeing how much was common. And that's when I realized that I wanted my Jewish friends to meet my Muslim friends from Pakistan, because I didn't want them to have the impression that I was unique and that I wasn't like the rest of them kind of Muslims. I wanted them to see my friends. And I also wanted my Muslim Pakistani friends to get to know my Jewish friends and see how nice all these people are. So we started meeting in my home, for dinner or whatever. And eventually these gatherings and these conversations moved out into larger spaces, into public spaces, into libraries, schools, academic places. And it grew from there. How about you, Walter? Tell us about your interfaith awakening.
Sure. So I became a reporter. I returned to the States in the early 80s. I became a reporter for Israeli and Jewish newspapers based at the UN in New York. And I covered a lot of stories, but my main one, I would say, was covering the Israeli-Palestinian peace process over a period of more than 10 years and seeing the ups and downs. And that was I came to really identify. I wanted to be kind of witness to history and see this all get resolved. Unfortunately, as you all know, in the early 2000s, the peace process crashed and burned. And so I became interested in Muslim-Jewish coalition building in the US as perhaps an alternative path to peace and reconciliation. I attended a wonderful congress called the World Congress of Imams and Rabbis in Seville, Spain in 2006. And that was an amazing experience with rabbis and imams from all over the world, including Israel and Palestine. And they were relating to each other in this kind of warm way, but also kind of so fascinated by learning about the commonalities between the two religions that suddenly I was inspired by it. And I said, my goodness, maybe these religious folks could be part of the solution, not necessarily part of the problem. And so then a couple of years later in 2008, I had an amazing opportunity to be hired by the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding as their Muslim-Jewish program director. And I think I may have been the only Muslim-Jewish program director in the world. It was like a kind of a new title. And basically my job was, there's a Hebrew Yiddish expression called shadchan, which is matchmaker. So really my job was to connect a rabbi and an imam in LA, and then another one in San Francisco, another one in Chicago, another one in New York, try to create, and then they would do twinning. So we had a thing called the weekend of twinning that we would do every year through the foundation, trying to get as many synagogues and mosques and Muslim and Jewish organizations to connect with each other and try to grow that around the world, first of all across America and then around the world. So it was an amazing job, and I often got to travel. I would travel, obviously. I would often have to go out to these places to actually bring them together physically. And when oftentimes I'd be on a plane at night, flying somewhere, and I'd be talking to the person sitting next to me, and he or she would say, well, what do you do for a living? I'm sure you've had those kind of conversations. And I would say, well, I bring together Muslims and Jews. And so first the person would invariably look at me like, what? and then when they saw that I was serious, they would say, oi, that must be the worst job in the world. I'd heard that quite a few times, believe me, over the years. And I said with absolute conviction, it's the best job in the world. Because first of all, it's been incredibly fulfilling and more successful than I ever would have imagined. Of course, there were challenges and setbacks, which Sabeeha and I will talk about a little bit, but overall, the desire of the two communities to come together just was very exciting, and it felt to me like holy work. Sabeeha, want to talk about the ground rules that we?
Yeah, so the best job in the world did have some ground rules. We decided, meaning when I was engaged in interfaith dialogue, still am, that we would focus on commonalities, our shared heritage and our shared values, and we would keep politics out of it. Agree to disagree on issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but keep the focus on what brings us together and what we need to do to keep ourselves together here in the United States. In fact, in the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom that I belong to, it is the rule that you will not engage in politics for at least 18 months. Allow relationships to develop, allow them to gel, build trust before you tackle some sensitive issues. What were your ground rules, Walter?
Well, pretty much all of the above. There was a slight difference on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which was that instead of saying, well, we can't talk about it for 18 months, when we would do a twinning, we would urge the rabbi and the imam at the beginning of the twinning event to offer a prayer for peace and reconciliation in Israel-Palestine, peace, justice, and reconciliation. So they would do that, and that would often be very moving. And we would feel like, okay, it's not being brushed under the rug, at least. But then we would say, look, having done that, we need to agree, that the rest of this meeting that we're holding will not be about the Middle East, but will be about Muslim-Jewish relations in New York, Chicago, Toronto, London, and so forth. And people basically abided by that. And it worked pretty well most of the time. Not perfect, as we'll say, but it worked quite well. And so I was connecting, as I said, with both synagogues and mosques, but also many Muslim and Jewish organizations. One that I connected with was called the American Society for Muslim Advancement, the ASMA Society. And I made a call over there to speak with its founder and president, Daisy Khan, but I got Sabeeha on the phone instead, as Sabeeha was working very closely with Daisy. So Sabeeha and I developed friendly relations, I should say, at that time. But we, at that time, I think, had no idea where the relationship would ultimately take us.
So where it took us was that one day, the Temple Emmanuel on Fifth Avenue was holding an interfaith iftar. I registered myself and my husband. And when we showed up there, the gentleman who was doing the registration was a Muslim man. And he said to me, I'm sorry, but I don't have your names on the list. But I registered. He said, well, you know what? We are full. Walter happened to be standing there. And Walter interjected and said, look, I've known Sabeeha for a long time. And if she says she registered, let her in. Well, we don't have enough food. Anyhow, Walter prevailed. We were allowed to enter. And I chuckled and said to my husband, the Muslim man stopped us and the Jewish man let us in. A few years later, I wrote my memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug. And as it was getting ready to go to print, I realized that I did not have a blurb from a rabbi, Walter. But Walter is not a rabbi. He worked for a rabbi. I sent him an email. I was in Pakistan at the time. I said, Walter, I've written this book. Do you think that Rabbi Mark Schneier would be willing to write a blurb for it? And Walter said, I have to read the book first. He was the book reader for the rabbi. And so he read the book and he wrote back to me and said, the rabbi will be happy to do a blurb. And Sabeeha, I have this idea. Why don't the two of us write a book? Right, Walter?
That's right. And this was a slightly strange request for, at that point, why would I have done that? Well, the thing was that when Sabeeha had originally asked me to read the book, I sort of, she'd asked me maybe a month earlier, and then, but I sort of had procrastinated doing other things. And then suddenly she called me and said, Walter, on a Friday afternoon, I actually need this Monday. So I said, oh, there goes my weekend. So I sat down to read it on Saturday, and on
the Sabbath, on your day of rest.
That is true. I'm not sure if we should, I guess that's okay. Anyway, it turned out to be, and I was blown away by how wonderful the writing was. I think many of you have already read it, but just the warmth, the humor, the honesty that Sabeeha conveyed. I said, boy, this is somebody I could, do a book with. And the thing was that I've been wanting to write a book with a Muslim co-author about the movement that we had created over the years, starting, as I say, around 2007 and 8, because I thought, this is a very, this is an untold story. I mean, people within this movement know it's happening, but too much of the world doesn't know it's happening, including too much of our own communities. So let's get the word out there. And also, by the time, though, that Sabeeha and I were getting ready to write the book, it was already 2016 turning into 2017, and you all can relate to what was going on at that point. And so it became a feeling that this book should also be a kind of manifesto in which our two communities, the two largest religious minority communities in America, should stand together in support of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom in America, all of which make our Muslim and Jewish life viable in this country and are so critical for the survival of democracy in America as well. So that's where the book started. And in the book, as well as Sabeeha and I began to develop our book, we decided that there were kind of four principles that really animated our work together and the larger work within the Muslim-Jewish alliance that was evolving. And so we want to just go through very quickly those four principles. So the first one we call save one life, because there's this expression in both the Quran and in the Talmud, almost word for word. If you save one life, you save the world. That's the thought. And but the thing is that very few Jews, know that is also in the Quran, and very few Muslims know that that's also in the Talmud. I had no idea. I was blissfully ignorant until late 2007. There was an incident in New York City where I lived at the time, where a young Bangladeshi immigrant by the name of Hassan Askari, obviously a Muslim, had been on the New York City subway late at night, and he saw several skinheads accosting 2 or 3 Jews and actually beginning, physically beating them. He jumped bravely into the fray, and in the process, he pulled the emergency cord. And so at the next stop, the police came on and arrested the hooligans. And Hassan was really banged up. He had 2 black eyes. His picture was in all the papers, including the New York Post, and he was like the subway hero. Anyway, I was at an event at a Muslim organization honoring him, and somebody said in relation to him that he exemplified this ideal: if you save one life, you save the world. That he was willing to selflessly jump into a dangerous situation, potentially even save a life. So I was just amazed by that, and that was in the Quran, and it illuminated for me that at the heart of Islam, like Judaism, is a commitment to mercy, compassion, justice, and the preciousness of every single life. Sabeeha, what about you?
Yeah, so I had no idea that this was in the Talmud. And I heard about it, and I'm going to tell you about it, read a bit from my book, our book, which just arrived. Holocaust Remembrance Day. We Muslim women had organized this event with our Jewish cousins, and Laila al-Askari spoke on behalf of the Muslims in the room. The world failed the Jewish community. It is our responsibility to make sure that this never happens again. And quoting the Quran, she said, if you kill one person, it's as though you have killed all of humanity. And if you save a life, it is as though you have saved all of humanity. This is similar to our scripture. A young Jewish man spoke up and then quoted the Talmud. I had no idea that the Jewish scripture contained the same injunction in almost the same words. It was like God simply reissuing the same edict centuries later, almost like a copy and paste. But why are we surprised? After all, it's the same source, same God imparting the same message to his prophets. The second principle that unites us is that of welcome the stranger. Both the Quran and the Torah contain this passage. The Quran says, those who migrate for the sake of God shall find many places for refuge in the land of great abundance. And in Leviticus, the strangers who sojourn with you shall be to you as natives amongst you, and you shall love them as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. My mother was a stranger in the land of Pakistan. She was a refugee. When the Indian subcontinent was divided and partitioned into India and Pakistan, my mother made a perilous journey from India over to Pakistan on a train. On the way, hundreds and thousands of people were massacred. She almost didn't make it to the other side. And we talk about this in detail in the book. But once she made it over to Pakistan, she was welcomed. She made her home there. She lived there. She thrived there. And till her dying day, she believed that if there was one place on earth that was custom made for her, it was Pakistan. Now let's fast forward to 2017, and the Muslim ban has been issued. We get a call, my husband gets a call from the rabbi of our local synagogue, Shari Tefillah, saying that we stand by you in solidarity, and to express that, I would like to go to a mosque with you. So my husband made arrangements, took him to the mosque. He stood, as he entered, he said, should I remove my kippah? No, keep it on. He stood there shoulder to shoulder with all the congregation offering the prayers. And when the prayers were over, people lined up to shake his hand and say, thank you. Thank you for coming. One of the men approached him and said, I wish I could give you a gift, but I don't have anything on me except for an heirloom, a family heirloom. And he handed him his prayer beads. And the rabbi took it, and the rabbi teared up. Walter, you have a similar story about your mother, right?
Yes, my mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany who fled across the German border with her own mother at the age of 14. And they escaped running across the Belgian border and then eventually went to France, but they were sort of stuck in France, and then the Nazis conquered France, and they were running from port to port like desperate animals looking for any safety. Eventually managed to kind of purchase visas to Ecuador. That got them to Lisbon, but they wanted to come to the States. They didn't want to go to Ecuador. And the thing was that the US had very strict quotas on Jewish immigration, even at this desperate moment, not just Jews, but many nationalities who were sort of non-Nordic at that point. As our former president said, they like Norwegians better than people from more southern regions, shall we say, or eastern. Anyway, the point was that they couldn't get American visas. So what they did is they got on a boat from Lisbon to New York with the idea that they would then get on another boat to Ecuador. But when they got to New York, there is a Jewish organization called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. They took my grandmother into New York to try to find someone who would with the same last name who would say, these are my relatives. And eventually they found a New York City judge who with the same last name who did that. And that's how they managed to stay in the States. But I should say that whilst my grandmother was in the city with HIAS, for a period of about a week, I think more than a week, my mother was held as surety on Ellis Island, to make sure that my grandmother didn't just disappear into the fabric of America. So that brings me to the Muslim ban. And 2 or 3 years ago, I was standing just before the Supreme Court was supposed to rule on the Muslim ban in 2018. I was invited to speak at a protest event in front of the Supreme Court. And I told this very story that I'm telling you now. And I said, what really hurt, what makes my blood boil in a way was when I hear this smearing denigration of illegals. And I said, listen, my mother, when she arrived here, she was an illegal too. And my mother went on to do wonderful things in America. She built her whole life here. She was involved in the civil rights movement. She did so many things. She loved America deeply. And, but at that point, she was just an illegal who, needed to be held for surety. So the parallels are very, very strong. And of course, as we know, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Muslim ban, a very shameful vote, in my opinion. It lasted until 2 months ago when President Biden got rid of it on his first day in office, which was, of course, a wonderful thing. So now we move on to the third principle, which we call Islah and Tikkun Olam. Islah is an Arabic word translated as reform in the sense of to improve or better or put something in a better position. Tikkun Olam is Hebrew for repairing the world. And it has come to mean over the centuries to connote social action or pursuit of social justice. For me, both concepts convey the common moral imperative in both of our faiths to help those who are most in need. And so we did, in terms of the twinnings that we did between mosques and synagogues, many of them, not all, but a lot of them involved feeding the hungry, or different acts of mercy and kindness, whether it was feeding the hungry, sometimes visiting the sick. We ran health fairs. We did many things. I had one very dear friend who Sabeeha also knows, named Zamir Hassan, who created an organization called Muslims Against Hunger. So he was kind of my Rebbe, as we say in Jewish, the one who kind of trained me, who brought me to this work. And Zamir would often say, it's great if Jews and Muslims come together and talk about their commonalities and differences and learn about each other. But I believe it's even better if we stand together in a homeless shelter, put on aprons side by side, and ladle out hot broth to homeless people. And in the process, while we're doing that, there's a bonding that goes on. There's a communication that maybe is maybe the best way of all to do it. Nothing better than that. Sabeeha, your thoughts?
And I belong to the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, where on Christmas Day, we all put on our aprons, we go to the churches, and we are giving out food to the homeless so that our Christian cousins can take the day off. And, when our soiled hands rub against one another as we are rinsing dishes, we feel that it's very rewarding to do a charitable act. But when you do it together, it becomes an act of joy. And if you're from different faiths, you wonder if you're really that different. The fourth principle that unites us is standing up for each other. When the travel ban was issued, and I'll read again from the book, on a bright sunny Sunday in February 2017, my husband and I stood in Times Square among thousands who were waving posters, "Today I am a Muslim too," except that they were not Muslims. They were standing there in solidarity against the travel ban. It had been organized by the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, Walter's organization. I walked through the crowd and I stopped in front of a lady in a wheelchair. She must have been in her 90s. She could barely lift her head. Think of what it took for her to be there. Somebody must have helped her get into her heavy coat, put her in a wheelchair, wheeled her out of the apartment, into the elevator, hailed a cab, lifted her out of the wheelchair into the car, folded her chair and put it in the trunk, got her to Times Square, got her out, wheeled her over the bumpy sidewalk, around the railings, into the square. I'm exhausted just talking about it. There she sat, joining the protest against the Muslim travel ban with her head bent, protesting loudly by her silent presence. This was a Sunday. All these people from the East Coast could have been anywhere on their day off, but they spent the day standing up for their fellow Muslim Americans. And then, only a few days later, the tables were reversed. And now it was turn for the Muslims to stand up for their fellow Jewish Americans. Right, Walter?
That's right, Sabeeha. And this principle of standing up for each other, had been really at the heart of the work that I had done at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, and we had done really from 2008 onward. And there were many wonderful examples of opportunities where Muslims and Jews stood up for each other at key moments. One of the things I did was sometimes speak at hearings for mosques, when they were trying to get zoning boards to say, okay, you can build a mosque in such and such a suburban community. And oftentimes there would be a lot of opposition, and they would say, well, there's going to increase traffic and there's going to be runoff. But the thing was that the churches and synagogues in the same community wasn't having the same problem. So I would go there as a Jew to say, it is not okay to discriminate. But just one of many examples of things that we all did. But, I think that work that many of us did over 10 years really built this trust and solidarity between our communities. And it really was so powerful and manifest after the Tree of Life synagogue, this horrible massacre, which was my own hometown of Pittsburgh, where 11 Jews were murdered at prayer, as you recall, in 2018. And immediately after that happened, I mean, within an hour or so, the many Muslims living in Pittsburgh had rushed across town to the Tree of Life, to stand outside in solidarity, to be there for the grieving Jews, to hug them, say, let us know what we can do. We're here for you. And then they started a fundraising effort in the Muslim community, first in Pittsburgh, but then across the US. And within a couple of days, they had raised literally several $100,000. So it was very powerful, because for people like me, I remember when this happened, I was so stunned. I said, you know, for the first time in my life, I don't feel safe as a Jew in America. It was like to me, such a shock. I mean, that this could have happened in America. It had never happened before that Jews have been gunned down like this. But then finally, there were memorial services in synagogues the next weekend after the massacre, and you know, many non-Jews came, Christians and Muslims. You know, for me, working in the Muslim Jewish work, it was just so moving, the huge numbers of Muslims who were there. I was at a synagogue in Northern Virginia, and I was surrounded by Muslims. There was a gentleman next to me who had brought his two small children to this memorial event, and I asked him, you know, why is you think so you're okay with your children hearing about all this terrible stuff? Maybe it will scare them or something. And he said, no, I have to be here, because when my friends and my neighbors are attacked, I have to be there. They're all this together, and my children need to see this, and they need to know this. And so for me, we reached out and we hugged each other, and it was an incredible moment. And that's the spirit that we need to carry forward. Sabeeha?
Yeah, so those were some of the success stories, but it always hasn't been that easy. There have been challenges. A challenge I continue to face is I find it very difficult to bring Muslim people into activism, interfaith activism. And in some of our chapters that I am part of, we have Jewish women on the waiting list to get in, and we can't get a chapter started because we don't have a critical mass of Muslim participants. I don't know what the reason is. Is it because we are a younger community, as in not having quite evolved yet? Is it the immigrant trajectory where we are still, you know, getting our footing? Is it that we are small in numbers? Probably not. Or is it lack of trust? I don't know, but it is a challenge. Walter, have you faced challenges?
I have, and you know, as Sabeeha says, there's some cities. Well, in my own experience, you know, there were cities in the United States where it was harder to get the Muslims involved in the work I was doing in these twinnings. There were also cities where it was harder to get the Jews involved. So Chicago was a tough one on the Muslim side. Boston was a tough one on the Jewish side. Those are two examples. But there were many cities, most cities across the country, it went wonderfully. So you would often wonder what was going on. There were a couple of issues that would impact things negatively, and we call them the elephants in the room. You know, the first that could set things back. The first elephant is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we've been talking about here, and so oftentimes, if things would get set back, it would be because there was a spasm of violence in Israel-Palestine, often around outbreaks of warfare in Gaza. I'm sure you remember on a number of occasions over the last 10 years, and you know, terrible things that would go on for weeks and thousands dying, airstrikes and rockets shooting on the other. So all of that, and what would happen often when those events would happen is people on both sides, they would just not call each other. It wasn't even that they were yelling at each other, but and these were people that had been involved in our work and had come to know and build personal friendships. But when this would happen, I guess they just didn't want to have that difficult conversation. So sometimes they would delay picking up the phone, and that would obviously set our work back across the nation. I would have to keep pushing people. Eventually they did come back. And that was the great thing, that I think that people felt that this relationship was so important that when they we'd get a little bit of distance from those traumatic events, it would move forward again, but we would be set back. The other one that we have a second elephant, which are, I think, doctrines on our respective holy books that tend to offend the other. And so for me, and now I'm speaking personally, I had felt for a long time, even though I was, very much involved in this work, that when I would read the Quran about how the Jews were presented in the Quran, it would make me uncomfortable. And I guess a lot of it was that there was a lot of condemnation of the children of Israel, back in biblical days, for betraying God during their sojourn in the desert, going from Egypt to the Promised Land. And you all remember about the worshiping the golden calf, and then Moses would go up Mount Sinai, and then he would come down, and he would be very upset by how they were behaving. And so this is very strongly laid out in the Quran, in very strong kind of, it seems to me, kind of waving a finger kind of language. But when I would express my sense of hurt to some of my Muslim friends, they would say, but it says the same thing in the Torah, that the Jews disobeyed, the Hebrews disobeyed God back in those days, and they were punished. And, of course, they're right about that. And so why would I be offended by what it says in the Quran, but not in the Torah? And I think the reason is, and, you probably recognize that I think that human psychology, it's much easier, to kind of criticize one's own, to make fun of one's own, if it's one's own. But if somebody else does it, uses the same words, it can, we get very defensive. So the main thing that came out of all this, I talked about this with Sabeeha, and we had very heartfelt discussions that are laid out in our book. But the main thing when you have that stuff is to pick up the phone and call. I mean, whether it's Sabeeha and myself or any of these relationships, if you're upset about Israel-Palestine, if you don't like what's in the Quran, if you don't like what's in the Torah, pick up the phone, call, and talk to each other, and that's the key to overcoming it. So those are some of the roadblocks. Sabeeha?
Yes, and finally, we would like to share with you some of the lessons that we have learned. We call it our 8-point roadmap. So number one is, we are Americans first. While the Israeli-Palestinian issues matter greatly to us, we live here, not there. And our own common homeland of America is threatened unless we unite to save democracy and pluralism. Walter, pick up on the next few.
Okay, so another one is, although we're Americans first, it is important that we speak out and stay engaged against injustice both at home and abroad. So it's very important. For example, if Muslims and Jews together make statements about some of the injustices going on against the Muslims and Jews abroad, such as the terrible treatment of the Uyghurs in China, the Rohingyas in Muslim groups in Burma, anti-Semitism that takes place, bombings in Europe and elsewhere, and also things in the Middle East. So that's also something we should do. Coming back to Israel-Palestine, I think one thing that I've learned in recent years is I've gotten involved in a group called Project Rosanna, which is an NGO which involved in helping to bring sick Palestinian children to hospitals in Israel. These are children with cancer in many cases, or in need of kidney dialysis they would die if they didn't get this help to get to these hospitals. And so we have volunteer drivers who bring them. And so that to me is something that we can do together to improve the situation over there. Instead of either brushing it under the rug or arguing about it, let's save life. Let's save one life, save that child, this child, and that child. And that's a really holy thing to do. And it will bring us closer together here at home. That's another one. The fourth one is allow others to speak up, even if we agree, whether we agree or not. So from the case of myself and the Jewish community, there are many things, as you know, there were two Muslim congresswomen elected in 2018, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, both very strongly pro-Palestine. And they've said some things that I found insensitive, but I feel like they have as much right to advocate for Palestine in the halls of Congress as Jewish members like Chuck Schumer or Ben Cardin or Lee Zeldin out on Long Island or Brad Sherman in California. They have his right to speak up for Israel. So I think we have to recognize that and honor that. We should not allow, another point, we should not allow the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be weaponized, to be used, and sometimes it often is by, let's say, interested politicians to drive our communities apart. President Trump's overt attacks on Tlaib and Omar, telling them to go back where they came from, is just one example of that. There are others. So we really have to be very careful, and we have to be there for each other and not allow us to get pried apart over the Middle East issue. Sabeeha, a few of yours.
Yeah, so number 6, let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. Activists like Linda Sarsour correctly demand that they be able to speak freely as proud Palestinian Americans. But we disagree when Zionists are demonized, such as a statement that it is impossible to be both a Zionist and a feminist. Number 7, Muslims should engage with mainstream American Jews who consider themselves Zionists, rather than allying themselves exclusively with anti-Zionist fringe groups like Jewish Voices for Peace. Jews should engage with Muslims like Tlaib, Omar, and Sarsour. We need to dialogue with people with whom we may disagree on the Middle East issue, but agree on many others, including advocating for diversity, freedom of speech, and democracy here at home. And finally, number 8, let's be cautious about labeling one another as anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. We acknowledge that there are sensitivities in both communities. Criticizing Israel's leaders or their politics is just that, a criticism of the policy and policy makers. It is not a declaration against Jews. Likewise, being critical of leaders in a Muslim country does not translate into Islamophobia. Yet we need to be keenly aware of the heightened sensitivities on the other side so that our critical statements are not construed as being anti-Semitic or Islamophobic, particularly if they are not meant as such. Walter, could you please wrap up?
Well, in conclusion, I remain proudly Jewish, just as Sabeeha is proudly Muslim, but we know in our bones, as we continue to work to overcome the estrangement between our faith communities, that we are human beings above all. And for the salvation of our two communities, our two beloved communities, and of our beloved America, Muslims, Jews, and allies need to redouble our efforts to ensure that America remains a land dedicated to democracy, diversity, equality, and justice for all. So thank you so much for listening to us, and we would be more than happy to take questions.
And while we're taking questions, I'd like to hold up the book that I just received the author's copy of, and my appeal to you, mine and Walter's, would be to please consider getting the book, reading the book. We just skimmed the surface, and tell your friends about it and share it with them. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Sabeeha and Walter. That was just wonderful. Let's see what we have at questions. I have one question that came in. Have you ever traveled to Israel or Pakistan together? Is it something you would like to do?
Okay, so it was on our agenda when we started writing this book. This was going to be the final chapter. Let's go there together. And then the way things were on the ground, neither of us felt that we would be able to guarantee the safety of the other. I wasn't sure about how Walter would be received in Pakistan, broadly speaking. I mean, he'd be very welcome in my family and amongst my friends, but there was tension. The political sands were shifting very rapidly. And so we gave up that idea. Right, Walter?
We did, although I should say, I don't know if you saw my Facebook post an hour ago. Yeah, I was sort of embarrassed. So what happened was that Sabeeha had written about this wonderful uncle of hers, who's called Jedi Maymun in the book. And so many of her memories and her historical accounts were based on that she mentions him in many occasions. So I had the opportunity when he was to meet him on Facebook and to say, I'm so excited to meet you. And then he wrote me this beautiful posting today on Facebook, just how how much he admired our book and thanking me for doing this book with Sabeeha. And I said, and he had written, I'd love to, when I come to America, I'd love to meet you. And I wrote, well, I still, I hope someday still to come to Pakistan and would love to meet you, be with you and other members of the family. And then after I pressed send, I said, oh, wasn't that a little bit presumptuous? I mean, I was inviting myself, but anyway, so hopefully it'll still happen.
Hopefully. Thank you for that question.
Yes, that would be an interesting trip. It's kind of like the lion lying down with the lamb, right?
I have been to Israel, but this was a while ago.
Okay, here's another question. How can we ever reach conciliation if either one or both sides thinks their position is authorized by God?
Right. Well, that's of course that's the tough one, and that's what we're struggling with on both sides, because there's plenty of extremism on both sides and plenty of extremism based on that very conviction. And but so we are struggling with that, and we're offering another way, which is that if we get to know each other and we connect on a personal basis and we build these ties and we're standing up for each other, on different levels, all the things we talked about, that's a much better way to go about things. And that does lead us toward reconciliation, as opposed to just standing there, we're right, you're wrong, we're good, you're evil. That, has been going on for 100 years, obviously, and it's driven our communities apart. As I said, the questioner, that was actually my prejudice in a way, as I mentioned earlier in our talk, that the religious communities were the problem, because they had this, oh, God sanctions all this stuff. And so when I was at that conference in Madrid, in Seville, I was so excited to see that there are so many rabbis and imams out there who don't think that way and who have a special ability to connect. So I haven't given up on the religion at all. I think the religious communities are an important part of the solution, potentially, although there are extremists on both sides, without any question.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Sabeeha.
No, I think Walter answered it well.
Okay. So along those lines, have you been able to dialogue with any people on the more extreme ends of each religion?
I have not. I don't think the opportunity has presented itself, and it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened in my sphere of having. I don't have access to the extremists. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know where to find them and how to get in touch with them, or get them to be willing to have a dialogue with me. I don't know them. So I don't know how I would do that.
Okay.
Well, in my community, I have, I think partly I had entree as a journalist, so I would visit settlements in the West Bank, for example, or, and I had, and honestly, there were occasions where I was giving public speeches 30 years ago, or more recently, in certain communities in the States in Jewish communities, where I would be hooted down and called names, and I'm a sucker, you're a self-hating Jew is one of the favorite ones. So you have to grow a tough skin, which is not easy for me because I'm not a tough person necessarily, but that I think it's very important to the extent possible, to go out there and role model this other vision. And sometimes, because there are people in those communities who just haven't been exposed necessarily to another way of thinking. And so,
I have had dialogue with the skeptics, not the extremists, but that's the skeptics. So as an example, when family comes visiting from Pakistan, they want to go see all the touristy places. So we take them there, but we also take them to a Sabbath service. We take them to the cathedral on Fifth Avenue. And when I have taken them to BJ and they have seen everybody singing and dancing and the joyous atmosphere. In fact, Khalid's niece, when she walked in and someone greeted her saying, Shalom Aleichem, she was like, oh, that's like Salam Alaikum. And walked out of there saying, but this was so much fun. And then few of my Jewish friends said, let's go out for dinner. And then over dinner, they are telling her, you can go see this place. This is how you should spend your time. And she came home writing a long email in the wee hours of the night to her mother back home and her siblings saying, I just had this amazing experience. And I just met some of the nicest people. And then what my husband does, Khalid, if every time something bad happens to us and our Jewish friends stand up to support us, and our Christian friends stand up, and our Hindu friends stand up, he will beam this across the world to his family in the diaspora saying, see how people are standing up for us. And that chips away. It chips away at the prejudice and at the stereotyping and at the negative image. So the skeptics we have had a lot of success with.
As you say so well, making peace one friendship at a time. We have another question here. Have you engaged the evangelical Christian community in dialogue? How would you imagine that would progress?
In my case, a little bit. You know, there are not all of the evangelical Christians are necessarily, you know, the stereotype of being hard right. In fact, I have to say my first wife was a Baptist who remains very religious today, and she you know, she's very progressive politically, and she keeps saying she can't understand you know that what they're presenting, which she says you know, the evangelicals of the right presenting that as Christianity, and you know, where's the mercy, where's Jesus's you know, merciful, you know, standing up for the poor and the rest of it, and turning the other cheek, where it's not that she doesn't see it. But anyway, you know, that so I've had those encounters. There's a wonderful man here in Washington called Richard Cizik, I guess, who has written on the importance of environmentalism, evangelical Christian. But again, the main, you know, as we know, the larger majority again are quite hardline, and so I have not yet really, you know, gone there, gotten really involved. So, Sabeeha, your thoughts?
Yeah. So my experience has been, my husband and I go to Chautauqua Institution every year before the pandemic, and we've been given the opportunity, the mic, to do an Islam 101 series of lectures on different topics throughout the week for as many weeks as we are there. And it's free and it's open to the Chautauquans. So we have a very diverse audience over there, which I assume would include evangelicals as well, because we do get some tough questions. And at one point, I remember that there was a woman was giving a lecture and saying, it's a good idea for you to tell your stories if you want to convert hearts and minds. Don't give facts and figures. That doesn't work. Personal stories does. So I got to the mic and I asked her, I said, you know, how do we reach those who are not willing to listen to us? They are the ones we really want to talk to. So how do we get them to invite us? And she said, they will not invite you, but they will invite people like me, meaning herself. So tell your stories to us and we will tell your stories to them. She took it a step further and said, don't overestimate the open-mindedness of your audience. Don't overestimate. The skeptics are there, but they came and they listened, and that's a start. So on that note, I would say, please invite us to your communities on Zoom. Walter and I will be happy to come anywhere, anytime, and let us tell our stories to anybody in your network and tell them about the book as well.
Mhm.
Thank you. Go ahead, Walter.
I just want to say one more quick thing, which is that, Sabeeha and I have been working on the Muslim-Jewish question because we feel, focusing especially on Muslims and Jews, because we feel because of our communities have been so estranged due to the Middle East conflict that we have very important work to do together. But I want to be very clear that we're not being exclusive. We're not saying, oh, we're just about Muslims and Jews and we don't like Christians or God forbid or anything like that. In fact, we have many wonderful Christian allies, but we feel that all of the communities together need to really stand up for these principles. And we're a building block, Muslims and Jews, but we're also going further, and we're saying that. So this is the principles that we're laying out are really for all of us.
Thank you. Here's another question. Is this work easier or harder in Israel? Have you done this work with Palestinians?
So yeah, it's harder, much harder over there, because the conflict is so intense. And I have to say, compared to here, it's really, in a way, a piece of cake over here. As I said, I didn't expect it would be as successful as it has been, but it was easier because we're further from the conflict. So I just have enormous respect for the people over there on both sides who do this work, and there's a lot of them who are doing it. Who I, been very, very touched and moved whenever I'm there just by what they're doing. The kind of opposition they're running into is so much more intense on both sides, and it's so much more complicated. But they are doing it, and they're quietly doing that work there. And so when we hear about all the terrible things that are happening, and and that those terrible things are happening, but there is this other side that unfortunately doesn't get reported nearly as often. For various reasons, maybe because good things are somehow not sexy to the media, which is an unfortunate thing. But anyway, but it is harder over there for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Sabeeha and Walter. This was a really wonderful presentation, and I know people will be interested in purchasing your book, and we'll be sending out some links to all the attendees. To make it easy for them to find your book. I think there's just one more quick question. Someone said, have you seen the movie The Other Son?
I have, twice, yes. It's such a moving movie. It was at Chautauqua, but the Jewish House had shown this movie, and it's beautiful. Yeah.
What's it about? If you could just tell us briefly.
It's about two boys that got switched at birth at a hospital in Israel.
I did see it.
And the Jewish boy got raised by the Muslim family, and vice versa, and how they find each other and try to reconcile with their circumstance. It's so touching. It's so beautiful.
Okay, so now we have a book to read and a movie to see.
Yeah, yes.
I recommend it too. Yes, it's great.
Thank you so much, and for participating and making your presentation. And thank you everybody for listening, and keep checking the events page on the TTN website to see our exciting spring lineup of individual events. So that'll be it for this afternoon. So thank you all. Someone just typed in, extremely interesting, keep up the good work. Thank you all. Fantastic. Thank you. This was wonderful. I'm just reading from the chat. So just to give you some feedback, on Zoom, it's really hard to get feedback. So I'm just giving it to you. It was really well appreciated.